Hi, everybody. Welcome to our panel on fighting unconscious bias in AI with diversity. Now, we hear and see a lot of headlines on how there are biases creeping into our algorithms. And one of the ways we think we can solve for it is by bringing more diversity into the AI design, development, testing, into the AI solution, right? And when we speak about diversity, we're primarily speaking about diversity from a gender perspective, from a race perspective, from an ethnicity, from geographical background, cultural background, educational background, because as we build these AI systems, for them to be fully robust, you need to have that diversity of thought feeding into these AI systems. My name is Beena Amanat, and I'm the Executive Director for Deloitte AI Institute. I also lead our Trustworthy and Ethical AI initiative here at Deloitte. Today, I have an amazing set of panelists here, amazing group of women, and I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts on this topic. Let's do a quick round of introductions. Let's start with Kelly.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly McElhaney. I'm on the faculty at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley, and I also founded and run our Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership. And thanks for having me.
Jana.
Hi, I'm Jana Eggers. I'm CEO of Neurologics, and really honored to be here with the rest of the panel to talk about this topic.
Alka.
Hi, Beena. My name is Alka Patel. I'm the head of AI ethics policy at the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center at the Department of Defense. And like everyone else, really excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. So we're going to structure this conversation out, try to structure it as much as possible around, trying to define what the challenge is, and then really go into how do we solve for it. Jenna, I heard you speak at Startup Fest a few years ago, and you made this point that bias was not necessarily the most pressing issue facing AI. Could you expand on what you meant and share your thoughts?
Yeah, bring my words back to haunt me. So, no, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I think it's really easy to talk about this big bad word bias without really unpeeling it and talking about how much is behind it. And I'll give you a quick example. Healthcare system that was rolled out to look at different funding allocations for different type of people and on Medicaid. And when it came out, allocations changed. And, that's always a problem, right? Any kind of change like that, I used to have some funding for this and now I don't have it. And people said, well, why did that happen? And the people who developed the system said, well, that wasn't part of our remit. Sure, we could have said why, but what we were really supposed to do was deliver the system, and we delivered it. And the engineer went a little bit further and said, I should be able to tell you why, but I should dust under my bed too. You're talking about someone's Medicaid payments.
Yes.
And that's the challenge. Is it isn't the bias that's there, it's our systems and our structures and way we've set up teams such that we do have that kind of value on display. And so this is why, to me, it's very important that we do have the diversity in teams. And you brought up, clearly gender and racial, but also just background. You could have gender and racial diversity and not have diverse backgrounds, right? You don't have someone that, I grew up in the South, right? and you don't have someone that grew up in the Northeast. So you really want to pay attention to all of that and get into these discussions about values. And they're hard discussions. These are not easy discussions to have. So that's why I think it's actually easier to say, oh, yes, we're focused on bias, yes, than it is to say, I'm going to have some tough conversations about your values, and I'm going to make sure, and we're going to talk about where we disagree.
So bias is a huge issue, but there are other challenges around AI as well, right? And the reality is that we as humans are all biased. That's what makes us human, right? being aware, self-aware that we are biased and bringing that diversity of thought is super important to really mitigating bias as well. And now, Jana, to your point, I would add that we go down this rabbit hole of bias, primarily from just looking at it from a gender and race perspective, but thinking about that diverse set of backgrounds that need to come to the table is so crucial. Alka, you're nodding your head. Would you like to add your perspective?
Sure. No, there's so much goodness in both of what you've said. And I'll just sort of pick on the word mitigate. So my background, I'm actually a lawyer, so I love the word mitigate. It's all about mitigating risk. And I'm going to piggyback off of what Jana said too. So when we think about bias, and at the Department of Defense, we have adopted AI ethics principles, and we adopted them last year. And so to Jana's point about embedding values, how do we do this as we think about these technologies? So we adopted these principles, and part of my role is really focused on like, how do we operationalize it? And that's always the hard part, right? How do we get tactical around this? And especially as we think about bias, we really look at it in terms of a systems approach, right? So not necessarily looking at pieces in isolation. So not just looking at the data, but looking at the human decision-making aspects, looking at the teams, as both of you have said, right? Like ensuring that we're taking this big systems approach rather than looking at these pieces in isolation, because there's a lot of interdependencies amongst all of those pieces, right? And so I will spare going through each of our principles for all of you, but obviously one of them is focused on equitable, and so taking intentional steps to mitigate bias, right? And so thinking about that, sort of the traceability aspect, and I'm going to focus just for a minute on the AI product lifecycle. So as we're thinking about designing, developing, deploying, and using these technologies, how are we keeping line of sight of these biases across the entire product lifecycle in sort of a systematic systems approach, right? And then we really focus on responsibility. And the one thing that we try to stress is that let's not just put all of this on the shoulders of the developers and the technologists. We all have a responsibility in this vein, right? Like we all have a responsibility to be trying to mitigate these risks around bias. And so as we think about going back to really the question, like our brain likes to take shortcuts, right? And we're going to take the easiest when we're sort of maybe in high stress situations, or when we're making a decision. We'll just take the easiest shortcut in trying to get to that decision. Or alternatively, our life experiences, as Jana was alluding to, like our life experiences are very different. And so how do we make sure that everyone's broadening their apertures to bring those life experiences in? And frankly, how we interpret the data. So like there's all these different pieces, right? And all of these pieces impact how we make decisions as humans, as well as potentially looking at the data for bias as well. And so how do we kind of capture all of that and think about it holistically to really manage and mitigate for the data bias, as well as sort of that human aspect that comes into this as well.
Yeah. Kelly, what are your thoughts about bias? And, I actually am curious, was it, the reason on why you set up EGAL and what this center does?
Yeah, so we set up EGAL because we really feel that we aren't training leaders with a sense of what we call equity fluency. It is the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we wanted to elevate the language away from diversity, equity, and inclusion, because those words cause a lot of emotional noise in people's brains for a whole host of reasons. What we do at the Haas School of Business is we develop leaders. So we really focused it on leadership. And some things that both Alka and Jana brought up. I mean, when I go in and work with companies, I will start out and say, you have two types of people at this company. Yeah. Those who are biased and know they are, and those who are biased and don't think they are. Mm-hmm. And that second group is highly dangerous to you as a company, to your products, to your services, to your culture. So the two things I'll just say quickly, Jana talked about difficult conversations, and giving people the language to be fluent, as well as the psychological safety to stay in difficult conversations. We don't like to stay in positions of discomfort. Comfort's a privilege. So how do you really give people just the psychologically safe environment. So Elka, so that a social scientist, I was so, intimidated by being on a panelist of AI experts. But when I hear that Elka is a lawyer, I think, oh, okay, so somebody, this is another sort of social scientist, not that law is social science, but just to give people the space to feel safe enough to say, hey, Jana, I think there could be possibly a problem. Can we test it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, so true. And, and somebody can look at this panel and say, this panel itself it's all women, but it also shows that we don't have diversity on this panel itself, right? We come from different backgrounds and we have, had different journeys to get here. I'll share a story before, and, to your point, right, where you said, there are people who know they're biased and are aware of it, and there are people who are, everybody is biased, and there are people who just don't know about it, right? So raising that self-awareness is super important. So I'll share an example. This was when I was setting up one of my very early days, setting up my first data science team, and the first 4 hires I made were all women. And I had to take a pause and think, am I hiring them because I relate with them better, or are they really the best candidates for the job? Because I did, interview a large group of diverse candidates. And then I reached the conclusion that, yes, they were the best candidates for the roles. But, being that self-awareness and then making a conscious effort to really, think through what can I do to make sure I'm bringing that diversity, right, to the table. So, and I don't think we should be removing biases from the human side, but it's more on when you encode your own biases. I don't want all the AI solutions that I build to carry on my biases, though I think I'm a perfect person, but we don't want AI scaling out as with my biases. Kelly, you are clearly an expert on equity, gender inclusion. What are some of the challenges that you've seen in AI development? What have you heard as you work with different leaders? And how do you think increasing diversity within tech roles can actually help reduce biases in AI?
I mean, it sounds a bit simplistic, but there's this social psychological phenomenon of you can't be what you can't see. So I think at the very base, women don't see themselves in these roles. There's sort of stereotypes about folks who are in AI or data technicians or coders. So I think that's the first challenge, is to allow women to see that they can exist, which is so fantastic with the 3 of you here who are extraordinarily successful in this space. I think making the environment inclusive. So we talk a lot about diversity, particularly in the tech sector. Well, we hired 5 more women this year than last year, or 2 more African-American engineers. What we know from the data is that people from diverse backgrounds are leaving specifically tech sectors faster. So it's not just about counting heads, it's really to double, if not triple down on making those heads count. And how do you create conditions so that all heads feel that they count? Because if I am the only woman on a coding team or a data scientist team, I may not feel comfortable speaking up. So what are some processes we can put in place so that everybody speaks up at a meeting? Do round robin. So people, whoever speaks the loudest and first, which data shows tends to be men, just go around the table so that we know everybody's going to have an opportunity to speak up.
Yes, so important. I think we've all been around long enough to have been only the women at the table multiple times. So yeah, and I think the big opportunity with AI is really we can solve for getting more diversity to the table. For AI to reach its full potential, it does need to get diversity, right? And it's actually, the belief is that you need these PhD in machine learning or PhD in AI. I love those people, but you also need people who understand the domain, right? And therein lies the opportunity for us to really bring that diversity from a domain expertise perspective and surround this homogeneous group of PhDs with that diversity through the product management or project management, testing, design. There's so much opportunity with AI to actually solve for this problem. But I would love to hear your thoughts on how do we solve for this problem? How do we get more diversity into AI? What are some of the things that you've seen, that you've learned through your career, that you can share on how do we take, solve for this problem? Jana, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, and I loved what Kelly and Alka both said. It's not just developers. Is a really good point on this. It's really product teams, and we've learned this in software engineering, and we haven't. We seem to kind of think that AI is something special, and so we put it in this other box. And we haven't followed even some of our best practices that we know of for software engineering teams. I mean, we already know we need diversity on software engineering teams. And now this new technology comes and we treat it something different. And I feel like we're not even using some of so much of that we know about how to develop good software. We're not applying that to AI. And Kelly, your point about you can't be what you can't see, that feeds right into that too, right? When people don't see themselves as part of an AI development team, they don't believe, they think, oh, user experience isn't as necessary there because it happens behind the scenes and it will happen over here and UX will just be the same. And that's not true, because we need to show people what's happening behind the scenes. We need to show them how they're using their data. That's a whole nother information piece. With our software, we're helping people make decisions. And so we need to show people at times the options, and that's heavy on UX, and there really aren't those people doing that. So I think those 2 points alone fit in, Bina, exactly with what you were asking about is, how do we do this? So part of it is, let's not forget tools that we've built with technology so far. Let's make sure that we highlight those roles and the different roles that are in this and how they fit in and bring them into the team. So I think those are big ones. The other thing that I'd say is, it's having the discussions and it does, you brought up the point about the PhDs in AI. And by the way, I've been working in AI for 30 years. So this is kind of, but it's always been a tool for me. And so when I started out with AI, it wasn't the hot thing to do at all. It was in one of the AI winners. This was back in the late 80s and early 90s. And the only reason I used it is because I needed it as a tool. And that's how I got started with it. And so most companies are never going to need the PhD in AI. Never. Mm-hmm. Very few companies need that. And great engineers are able to pick this up. And so what you want to do is fit this into the processes that you have now that are helping you develop, adopt the best practices that we've learned for software engineering. Not that we're great, don't get me wrong, but we do know how to do that. We know what works. Now we just need more people doing it. So those are probably the three things that I'd say is, use the processes that we have found that work. Make sure you adopt them. Make sure that you have all those different team members and that people understand that they're part of the AI team. And then lastly, I love the PhDs in computer science and AI. Don't get me wrong. It's not about that. But likely you don't need them in your company, in your organization. There are very few places that do.
Yeah. Alka?
Sure. I love everything Jan just said. And it's what we think about too, as we think about operationalizing our principles. A lot of it is really, to Janet's point, really embedded in good engineering practices, right? Like we know what good engineering practices look like. So let's apply them here. And of course, there's going to be additional nuances specific to AI, but we have a foundation to start with. The other piece that we're trying to tackle at the same time, which is around organizational culture and operating structures. And this also speaks to what both Kelly and Jana have alluded to as well, right? So how do we, I use the word responsible AI literacy as sort of the term that we're using internally in terms of how do we increase that within the organization so that there's even awareness that this is an issue, right? Like to Jana's point, like, I think AI, there's been a lot of hype around AI, right? And I think it's sort of been inflated to like this magic dust, or it's going to solve all our problems, right? And that's not the case, right? Like, and it's something that you and I, and you know, I'm not a computer scientist. I don't have as many years as Jana, or have been, you know, really embedded in this, or know how to well, I won't tell you what I learned to program in many years in engineering school, because it's probably totally out of date. But in any event, like, the point is, like, you can learn this. This should be accessible, and everyone should be participating in this conversation, right? And this is my sort of soapbox internally. Again, not going to, like, this is not just the developers. This is everyone can participate in this conversation. But then also thinking about, like, requirements and incentives. So one of the things that we're doing with our project teams is we are requiring, or we've tested this out at the JAKE in terms of having an integrated product team where we require different disciplines at the table, right? So not just the developers, but let's get the policy people at the table. Let's get the testing and evaluation folks. Let's get the UI UX folks. Like, let's get that diverse group as part of our project teams. And that should, you know, at least start to increase the diversity of experiences and backgrounds as part of the conversation. And then ultimately, you know, as an organization, incentives, it's usually incentives that drive behaviors, right? And so what are the right incentive structures to get the behaviors that you want until that muscle memory has been built, right? Until it becomes second nature. And so I think it's sort of all of these different pieces in tandem that need to be considered and addressed to really get us to that next step.
Yeah, no, and I think you know, driving that muscle memory, and a lot of times it's also agreeing on what are the ethical principles that we you know, we are agreeing to, right, as an organization or as a team, right? Because of our different biases and backgrounds, we do come with those, you know, the principles might be slightly different. So how do you align around one and then drive that training and, you know, building out that muscle memory? So important. Kelly, what would you like to add?
I've brought up two really good points. One is the culture, and the culture is set at the top. And I think we move really quickly to processes and how to debias processes. And we need to start with people first. And the second thing, I just gave a keynote to a really large organization with 1,200 people in the Zoom room. And I just did a simple poll, all these fun ththings you can do now because you can see immediate data come right back at you. But I asked how many of you think DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion is important? And of course, this is who's gonna say it's not, right? And then the second bar chart checked for how many of you is this part of your job? And you started to see it creep down. And the third question was, how many of you are measured on your contribution at this firm to equity? And it just went, shoo. And so that's, you know, a really simplistic look at what are some big barriers to this being everybody's job.
Yeah, and I know you've you know, you've actually developed a playbook called Equity Fluency Playbook. Can you share a little bit more about that?
We put together, we have a series of playbooks. That's kind of the corporate focusing content for our center. And far and large, our most popular one and just largest is bias in AI. But we were really targeting this at the business manager. So I think there's all this focus on technologists and engineers and coders being biased. We have the same problem in MBA programs. So I'm just here to lay that out. And one of our sort of realizations is that we need to train our students who are going to manage projects that involve AI. They're going to be hiring engineers and coders. They're going to be making decisions on promotion. So it was really to look at, obviously the layout is there of what are the cases of bias in AI. What are some of the most, you know, Google facial tagging Black women as gorillas, you know, it's just, and that was a really long time ago. So the fact that we're still talking about this is a little astounding to me, because I remember when I read that was pretty much one of the more horrific things I read. But really, so the playbook does go over the literature review of AI and bias, but it is how do you manage it? It's all the things that Alka and Janet are talking about. We're quite proud of the playbook, and it's on our website.
Yeah, no, Kelly, and I've heard you speak. I mean, you know, it's amazing because I think it has to be addressed from multiple levels, right? We're living in this interesting times where AI, the core technology itself, is growing. The applications are getting rampant across different industries and sectors in the real world. And then there is, you know, the impact, right? The consequences of using this technology when the regulations are not fully developed. There's no real playbook on, how to mitigate bias or how to think about unconscious bias and actually solve for it, right? So one of the things that we do at Deloitte is really, there is looking at the tools that we use, and we have a framework that we're using, which is really around 6 core pillars or dimensions on thinking about ethics, and bias is a crucial part of it. The other piece is really bringing in, because there is no playbook. We know that there are different groups, both public sector, private sector, academia, startups. There are all these different entities that they're all working on trying to solve for the same problem. So trying to connect it all under one umbrella around the Deloitte AI Institute, which is really about pulling together the AI ecosystem together. And having conversations like this, which I learn every time, and we all learn. This is the only way for us to make progress, because there is so much happening in this space. To Alka's point, AI has become this hype and headline, and sometimes even though we are in the field, you're not fully sure of what is real versus what is hype. One of the important things I feel is really driving AI literacy, right? Making AI accessible. I mean, we hear a lot about the citizen data scientist, which is still, to some extent is about building AI, but I think AI literacy should be something that everybody should have, so that you can actually have a conversation at the same level, right? Have you seen any initiatives or anything around how can everybody become AI fluent?
One of the examples I often bring up is Finland, because Finland has gone and really dedicated themselves to training their entire country. And I mean, everyone, every single person. They have a huge initiative. Their work is online, but I often say when executives tell me that, well, I don't know if we should be training our whole company. I say, look, if Finland can train their whole country, you can train your whole company. And what I love about that is their focus is people need to be informed consumers of this. They need to start understanding, and you can understand the basics of it, and you can start to think about, oh, well, how is this company or that company using my data? And when I do give the data, do I want them to have that? Do I want them to have it now just for this? Do I want to have, you're all now getting the location when you bring up an app on your phone, it says, location just when the app's on, or location all the time. Those things come from a consumer understanding what's going on. So I do think that's a huge thing, is not, absolutely what's happening. Kelly and Alka, both their framework and the culture that they're driving and the companies are absolutely, and organizations are absolutely critical. But that general knowledge really needs to be happening. And I have to say, I think Finland is the one that's been the most out there and talked about it, and talked about, even dentists coming to class, and they're training people that are in prisons. And I mean, this is really an incredible initiative to do something like that. And I think we have those types of opportunities to do as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. What about you, Kelly or Alka?
I love this Finland example. I'm often just struck by, I think Finland considers themselves Northern European, but I put them in more of the Scandinavian block. But the way that they really just are aggressive on education and staying ahead of the trends. I think it's really tough in the United States, partially because of our systemic racism in our educational system. So I think that we have so many strikes against us. It's not to say we can't do it, but we really have to figure out who we are doing it with and who we're leaving behind. And then, and as I was listening to you talk, I'm teaching undergraduates this semester, and you were talking about putting it out to the consumer to understand, to be educated so that we can understand. And I'll tell you, this generation, so what, they're under 20, I'd say, when I give them that solution, they're like, do not blame the individual. Like they were so emphatic when I suggested that it might be, we all use our dollars. It was not an AI example. I won't use the corporation that we were talking about, but They are just really distrustful of the corporate world, and these are business school students. And so I think we have to continue to ratchet down on both. I do think it is very much my responsibility to educate myself on a whole host of things. But I just want to lay the unpopular news out there that with this generation, they're highly distrustful and skeptical of the corporation. So we have a lot of work to do.
But
and I agree. I want to be fair. I was not blaming the consumers.
Yeah.
that wasn't it at all.
Yeah.
I was saying I blame us for not helping the consumer and making a more literate consumer so that they can make those decisions better, so that people understand how this works. And that's no fault. That's on us as technologists. It's on us.
Yes.
So I absolutely agree with you. And I think sadly, some of that distrust is because we haven't done that groundwork.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't shown where there is. I mean, the same kids that do that, at least in my circles, are also the ones that much more freely give their information online, right?
Absolutely.
So their parents and grandparents are terrified, of what they're sharing online, and they're like, it's okay. So it's interesting. There's this tension there between, I don't trust the big companies, but I'm going to let them have all my data because it helps me, have fun with my kids.
I want to dance on a video and get 1 million views. No, you're very right on that.
Yeah, and I think it's a generation thing too. And some of the distrust might actually drive the change that we need. I have 2 teenager boys, and they will, they understand the implications because I keep telling them, but they will happily share their data. It is just that mindset, like, they are ready to give it up for their, getting the right songs or, being recommended the right things, right? They are willing to share it for their experience, but I don't, I completely agree with Jana that we as technologists need to, people who are on this side building the AI, designing the AI, who are more active, need to be pushing that literacy to make sure that everybody can be part of this journey, right? Otherwise, we are leaving a whole host of voices behind.
And I'll just kind of jump in for a quick second here, because everything that has been said resonates so much. And just going back to the informed consumer aspect of what Jana was alluding to, I mean, as a consumer myself, right? If I have applied for a job and some company is using AI to make that hiring decision, then I would like to know that, right? Like, or if there is a credit decision being made or a health decision being made, right? As the consumer, I want to know that. And I think not only do I want to know that from a technology perspective, but like there are many, many other societal individuals that don't even realize that AI is being utilized, right? Like forget understanding how AI works, but the fact that AI is even being used as a solution versus perhaps a doctor doing, using their formal training and using a formal process to come to an assessment. So I think and on the other side, like from the technology's perspective, like I think we also have a responsibility to, and organizations have responsibility when they are putting out their technologies that use AI to make sure people understand that, like that AI has been utilized so that society can increase in their awareness of that understanding. The other thing I'll throw out there too is like I'm optimistic because I am starting to see a lot of AI education for K through 12. It's not exactly where it needs to be, right? And it's not being done holistically. And to Kelly's point, right? Like we really need to take a holistic picture to make sure everyone is being brought together in this conversation and that there aren't communities being left out or access issues so that they're not being part of the conversation. This isn't gonna work unless we're all in it together. And so while those efforts are sort of give me hope, I think we need to double down on those efforts because that is sort of the next generations, right? Like we can do what we can, but they've got to sort of lead that effort as well.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And sometimes it becomes one of those, to Kelly's point, right? We have much larger problems, which is actually, which we actually need to get over to get to the, solving for diversity and inclusion. Kelly, what have you seen in your experience working both on the academia side and with corporate clients? That's really, what are some of the best practices that you've seen that companies have taken to drive more diversity within their teams?
It always starts at the hiring. So, the traditional excuse that I hear, and I recognize there's a little bit of truth in it, but it's the pipeline. So it's really finding new pipes. There are so many pipes that are not being utilized. So I was just talking to a company where they only go to the top tier engineering schools to recruit. Well, you are constraining your universe by only going, what's wrong with community college? What's wrong with, some of these universities, historically Black universities, Hispanically certified universities. So I think the hiring piece is really critical, because if you don't get diverse heads in the door, you're already at a stop. The second one, I just have to say, it's pay equity. When you talk about inclusion, being paid equally to your male counterparts, or if you're Black, to your white counterparts, it's probably one of the best ways to feel included, is simply to focus on pay equity. So if I were just to tell any company to start, it is to look at hiring, and it is to look at your pay data and see where you are on that, and to collect the data and be willing to share it internally and do something about it.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And Jana, as you're building your teams, how do you ensure that there is diversity within your team?
It's a great question, and Kelly hit the nail on the head, which is pipelines. And we're so used to in technology, particularly, I'm a startup person. This is my 7th startup. I've been at big companies only because they've been acquired. Fortunately, that's a good thing. My startups have been acquired. So what I'd say is, it's easy to go back to, especially in startups. It's like, I want to go back to this person I know and this person I know, because there's a lot of startups are pressure cookers. And so I've learned a lot with this, because I made it a focus for us. And because it was important for AI in particular, and it is finding the different pipelines. The other pipelines they come to you, it's like, we've worked together before, but it's finding new places and reaching out to other people saying, hey, I'd love to work with you, but who's the best like you, right? That you've seen. And, hey, I'm looking for someone with a little bit different experience from you, but like you in this. And I will say some of that's been really good in going to people who I really respect and adore, and, they may be interested, but just starting the conversation with, who's like you, who reported to you that you were like, wow, I felt like they were like me when I was earlier in my career. So things like that. And it's not easy. It's a lot more work, as Kelly said. It takes a lot more time, but I will say I think it's worth it to do that, even as a startup. I mean, in a big company, absolutely, do that. In a startup, it's a little bit harder to do for different reasons, but it's absolutely worth it.
Yeah, completely agree. And that's part of the challenge, right? The pipeline, and then once you get them in, retaining and making sure that their voices are heard. One of the challenges is also, because challenges or opportunities is, especially with AI, is really we are going to be forced to bring in diversity of thought, right? The companies that survive with, and continue to lead in AI will have diverse teams, right? Alka, what has been your experience? And I know, you've been, on the policy public side with the DoD, but also on, with academia, and, you've had a whole other career as well. What has been some of the best practices that you've seen and adopted?
Sure. So I'll just start with where I'm at right now for a moment. So I think I'm going to go back to something we've all talked about, education, right? So I will say, how many AI ethicists have gone into school for training for that, right? Like how many, now these programs are starting, right? There is an awareness. these programs are starting, but it's not like I went to school for this, right? And so you learn as you go, but you have to have some basic skills around like critical thinking and problem solving and questioning. And so I think sometimes looking for a different skill set that can translate and can pick up a lot of this is helpful. And I've realized that as we try to grow our group internally at the JAIC as well. So I think education is key. Like we've got some amazing talent within the DoD, and so how do we upskill them to where they need to be and then put them into the appropriate roles? The DoD also has like different ways to bring individuals in, and I know that's a little bit different than private industry, but where we can connect with corporations and academia to bring them in for a year or 2 years, right? And help us sort of get to where we need to in certain areas. And so we've got these different vehicles and different tools. And I think maybe this goes back to maybe something Kelly said, like we have to reimagine and rethink, right? Hiring and sourcing for AI talent. It's not the traditional way is not going to work for the speed and mass at which we need scale that we need to do this at, right? And so I think we have to be creative in the way we do this. So I'm really excited that the DoD has many of these different opportunities to allow for that. Separately, I will just say, I think when I think about my private industry days, and this is in different contexts, so not exactly one-to-one with AI, but I think professional development and investment, right? Like corporations spending the time to invest in their employees. And they've done that, right? Like that has been, for the most part, corporations do that. But I think it's going to require a different level of commitment for AI as it relates to, if that is going to be a core part of their business, then they need to commit to the professional development aspects. I also go back to the whole incentives piece in terms of, again, trying to move the needle on talent and recruitment. And to your point, you know, if you want to retain them, you've got to be, again, sort of creative, allow for flexibility. You know, I think before COVID, working remotely for many corporations was not always a perk, so to speak, that was afforded to individuals. And now, you know, we want to bring everyone into the workforce. So working parents, people who may not have transportation to get to the job, so let them work remotely. So again, just being more creative and open and willing to try different things when it comes to AI talent.
Yeah, no, so true. And Kelly, were you going to add something?
No, I just was, I guess in my mind was thinking about some good things that might come from COVID is just this ability to create the workplace that you want and not have to traverse all of those barriers of getting into the office.
Yes, so true. Do you, and I'm going to ask you this question, in your personal experience, what have you seen as an example of unconscious bias? When have you caught yourself being biased and you realized and you did something about it? Like the example I gave is about those hires that I had made, and and I had to take a pause and think about why did I hire 4 women, right? And really thinking through it. But can you share a personal example when you realized your own bias? We cut out the silence.
So I'll throw out one, and it's kind of similar, Veena, to yours, except a little bit nuanced in terms of the skills. Yeah. So, sometimes it's easier to potentially, when you're looking at a resume, to see where are shared experiences, right? Mm-hmm. Where is that point of connection? And so obviously that could lead to a very uniform type of work group. And so it is intentionally recognizing that, stopping and pausing to like reevaluate and say, all right, wait, these different experiences, okay, maybe I don't relate to all of these things on an application, but they bring a different voice to the table. And I think, I think that happens to, I don't want to say all of it, I don't want to speak for everyone, but like that is probably a common experience. And then also I think where the value comes in is like actually helping someone else catch and recognize that, right? And I think that can be valuable. And I think of a situation where I had in my prior life where, you're on these hiring pools or hiring committees, and mainly male dominated. And this person, to Kelly's point, went to the top tier college, and our parents may know, their parents may know each other, whatever, in the same social circles.
Yeah.
And kind of stop that in its tracks and be like, no, like, wait a second, what is the criteria that we're using? Are we using the uniform criteria for everyone? Keep that sort of extra stuff out of this conversation, and let's measure everyone the same based on the criteria we decided on before we looked at any applications.
Yeah. Just to pick up on that, the structured interview, if you do not use structured interviews, it is like writing with your left hand, because so much bias, I just was on a search committee, shockingly, for our chief DEI officer at Haas, and one of the candidates I had worked with in a previous job. Didn't even occur to me when we were evaluating the candidates for me to talk about, it was positives about me working with her in the last job. And we have an HR observer who is in there saying, doesn't matter, you didn't work with the others, so that information is not relevant, stop talking. And I was like, oh gosh, we have set questions, and you ask every candidate the same question, because to Aqua's point, the biggest bias in hiring happens during small talk.
Yeah.
Oh, you're from Connecticut, we have a beach house there. Oh, my mother, was probably your teacher, and this, and that's like, you're already off the rails right there. And I'm a chatty person. I love small talk. And so that's where I'm most hyper aware with myself.
Yeah. And I, and this is not really tied to AI, but, I'll share this experience with you on, where I experienced unconscious bias against me. This was, in one of my previous roles, working for this amazing male leader. I mean, he was brilliant. He was really empathetic. He was a great leader. And, but he had a staff meeting. It used to be like, it would start at 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. And, all my peers were men. So, it was, 6 men and me in the room in the staff meeting. But at around 5:30, when the meetings, which always ran over, he would turn to me and say, Bina, he knew my kids were young at that time. He knew I had to pick up kids. He would say, Bina, do you need to leave, to pick up your kids? And I was like, why are you asking me that? And I just felt really weird, right? Now, one of my peers, who was a man, he, so I always felt singled out. He actually had to leave early on certain days because, that was his arrangement with his spouse. His wife worked late, right? So he needed to leave early. And he came to me and said, the boss really prefers you. He only asks you. Now, I was feeling victimized, but this guy felt that, he was playing favorites with me, right? So, it was one of those where I realized maybe he doesn't even know. So I talked to my boss and told him that, look, this is how, I feel. And he was so apologetic. And going forward, he just changed and said, does anybody need to leave because, we are at time. So, I always realize, it's hard to raise that awareness, but it's important because people really do want to change. They are many times not aware, right, of their own unconscious biases. So it's up to us to raise the awareness as well.
Yeah, and have the conversation. That's great that both you and your male colleague could admit how you were experiencing that same context.
Very differently. We experience very differently. And, you just have to understand that everybody has unconscious biases. How do you raise more awareness? How do you have that one-on-one conversation when you experience it? So, Jana, did you have an example you wanted to share?
I just briefly, because of time, I will say what I was alluding to before. I think in a startup, you often have a bias towards hiring other people that were in startups. Yep. And there's a few things that come with that, right? I mean, one, you don't get the other experience of people that have been in large organizations, but there's also some privilege associated with being able to be in a startup because it's riskier. Yeah. And so I've become more aware of that as I've gone into these situations. So it's definitely one that I had before from early on is that there are startup people. And I love, both what Kelly and Alka said, and Alka, I think, brought this point out, which is really going back to what is the criteria that you're hiring for. I'm not hiring for a startup person. That's really not what I'm hiring for. But I am hiring for someone that has, you're looking for somebody that's flexible, right? And I don't mean like work flexible. I mean, there's all of that, right? But I mean like in your thinking. So I don't have to be like, okay, this is what you're telling me to do. I'm only going to do that. Because in a startup, it's like, oh, we see this. We're still finding, product market fit, for example. So what I say is, kind of backing up from that and saying, what is being a startup person? Anyway, break it down into those bits and then say, well, where else could somebody have seen that? Well, gosh, somebody that was working their way through school was doing that all the time, right? I know I had 3 jobs. So, someone who's doing that, who can switch from, being a cashier at a pharmacy to, working in the school's computer lab to taking classes, that all of those kinds of things can make you, you learn that kind of flexibility in your brain. And that's just one quick example, but both what Kelly said and Alka said really reminded me of that kind of experience.
Yeah. So we are almost at time. And my last question is a bit of a catch-all. Really, what is the one thing that you want listeners of this panel to walk away with, to keep on top of mind as they think about AI? And we will go with in alphabetical order. So Alka, what is one thing you want the audience to take away from this session?
Sure. So nothing like leaving the hard question till the end, right, Vina? One thing in 1 minute or less. So the one thing I would say is challenge assumptions. Basically challenge everything. To starting with, is AI even the solution? To, or is my data biased? What's happening with my model, the outputs? So challenge everything. Almost walk in there. And this is my negative sort of legal side of things, which is like just assume and take just assume everything's could go wrong, will go wrong. And so how are you going to mitigate for that? And how are you going to try to minimize all of those types of situations as you're thinking across the product lifecycle as well as the organization in terms of adopting AI?
Great one. Jana?
Yeah, I completely agree with challenging assumptions. And the one thing I would add quickly is challenge that assumption that AI isn't explainable, because it is. And it's really critical. Even the blackest of boxes, in my opinion, with AI can be unpeeled quite a bit. And people just go with the assumption, well, it's AI, we can't explain it. And it's just not true. I was doing it 30 years ago. And because I had to, because the scientists I was feeding data to looked at me and said, but why is that? Because they were then going to have to go fabricate what I said was theoretically possible. And so it takes more compute time, but you build that in. So that's the one thing that I ask people to walk away with on top of what Alka said.
Awesome. Kelly?
I get to build on both. I think it's really to challenge the concept of culture fit. Particularly, I think in tech sectors, venture as well, we tend to overuse cultural fit, and what the shift in mindset is culture add. So it gets at inviting in the human behavioralists, inviting in the sociologists, anthropologists, and both of the speakers touched on it and how they're doing it in their careers. And what I heard was they're challenging fit, and that is just such a brilliant solution.
This has been wonderful. I mean, we all have diverse backgrounds. It is obvious during this panel that, we come from very different backgrounds, but look at, what a great discussion this has been. I've certainly learned a lot, and I really wanted to thank you all for taking the time today to be part of this discussion. Thank you.